Imagine an entire army, thousands strong, vanishing without a trace. This isn't a fantasy novel, but one of history's most baffling enigmas. The Lost Legion of ancient Rome. What really happened to them? Was it a brutal massacre, a desperate escape, or something far more extraordinary? Asterisk, the story of Rome is full of victories carved into stone, battles recorded in detail by men who lived through them, and triumphs paraded through the streets of the capital. Yet there are also silences in the record, events that appear as faint shadows on the edge of history. Among the most enduring of these is the disappearance of an entire Roman legion in the early 2nd century. It is not a story of glory preserved in marble, but one of absence. You can imagine the empire, so precise in its record-keeping, so dependent on the steady rhythm of administration, suddenly having to face the strange reality that several thousand trained soldiers had simply ceased to exist in the official lists. It was not a battle with trumpets and standards held high. It was paperwork that revealed the loss. A legion once named, counted, and paid for was no longer there. To understand how unusual this was, you have to think about the sheer orderliness of Rome's military system. Each legion was more than just soldiers. It was an institution, a structure, woven into the fabric of empire. A Roman legion contained roughly 5,000 men at full strength, supported by officers, engineers, clerks, doctors, and slaves. They marched, ate, and slept in patterns that were nearly mechanical. Pay records were carefully maintained, supply lines were monitored, and even the deaths of ordinary soldiers were entered into lists for compensation. Losing a legion was not like losing a single battle. It was as if an entire city had fallen. Off the map, without explanation, the legion in question was the 9th. Its name carried the memory of campaigns in Spain, where it had first earned its honor. Later it served in Britain, where it fought against uprisings among the local tribes. The 9th was no minor formation. It was old, experienced, and proud. Yet after the early years of the 2nd century, its name disappears from the official rolls. It is not mentioned in inscriptions after a certain date, and when the next generation of military documents appear, there is no 9th Legion to be found. Some historians place its end in Britain, others in the East, but the fact remains, somewhere in the wide expanse of Rome's empire, thousands of soldiers met an end that was never formally recorded. Daily life in the legion was slow and grinding, the kind of rhythm that makes the suddenness of disappearance more striking. A Roman soldier spent most of his time not in battle but in labor. He built roads, dug ditches, hauled timber, and constructed forts. In Britain, where the weather was wet and the ground often boggy, this meant endless days of mud. The soldiers of the 9th would have woken at dawn to the call of the trumpet, rolled up their blankets, and eaten a breakfast of bread and porridge. Then they would have assembled for orders, some sent to gather wood, others to patrol the roads, still others to practice drilling in the rain. These small details matter, because they remind us that a legion was not just a fighting force, but a community, a daily existence that could stretch for years. When such a group vanished, it meant that all those small habits, the shared meals, the polished armor, the weary footsteps, were abruptly brought to an end. The environment in which the 9th served was not kind. Northern Britain, especially in the early 2nd century, was still a contested frontier. The tribes there, such as the Brigantes and Caledonians, were skilled at guerrilla tactics. They struck quickly, melted into the forests or hills, and waited for another opportunity. The Romans, trained for pitched battle and open fields, often struggled against this kind of warfare. Forts were built across the north as a way to secure the land, but each fort also became a potential trap, isolated and vulnerable. A legion on campaign in such terrain could easily be cut off. Marching through mist-covered valleys, listening to the sound of distant horns or cries in the night, soldiers would have felt the unease of being far from the safety of stone walls. We do not know if the Ninth met its end in an ambush, in a prolonged war, or simply through attrition over time. What we do know is that silence replaces its presence. Inscriptions that once proudly bore its name cease. The Emperor Hadrian, who visited Britain in the 120s, is thought to have faced serious unrest there. Some scholars suggest that the loss of the Ninth may have been one reason why Hadrian decided to build his famous wall across the north of England. A wall was not just a fortification, but a statement, a way of drawing a line and saying, this far and no further. If indeed the Ninth was destroyed in Britain, then the wall may have been, in part, a memorial in stone to their fate, an attempt to prevent such a loss from happening again. Think for a moment about how news of their disappearance would have spread. The empire was vast, and information moved slowly. A message carried from Britain to Rome could take weeks. Imagine the clerk in Rome, sitting at a wooden desk, scratching names on a wax tablet. He turns a page of the records and realizes that the expected reports from the Ninth Legion are missing. Another month passes, still nothing. At some point, someone had to write into the official lists that the Ninth Hispana was no longer in service. No speeches were made, no memorial carved. It was a quiet erasure, a gap that later generations would puzzle over. What makes this story particularly strange is that Rome prided itself on memory. Victories were carved in triumphal arches. Even defeats were sometimes acknowledged, if only as warnings. But the Ninth's fate is left unsaid. Was it shame? Was it indifference? Or was it simply that the bureaucratic machine had no category for such an event, and so the silence was easier than an explanation? The boring part of this history is the paperwork, the steady ticking of imperial administration. But it is in that boredom that the mystery lies. A legion, reduced to numbers and lists, disappeared from those lists. That is how we know they were gone. No grand battles, no heroic last stands, just an absence in the records. And so you are left with a question. If the Ninth Hispana could vanish from the heart of the empire's system, what else might have been lost, quietly and without trace, hidden in the silence of forgotten paperwork? Life in the shadow of the frontier. When you think about a Roman legion, it's tempting to imagine only the bright details, the shining armor, the proud standards held aloft, and the sound of marching boots on paved roads. But the reality of service was far slower, heavier, and far more monotonous than the images carved into triumphal arches. To understand how the Ninth Hispana could disappear, you must understand what it meant to live as one of its soldiers in the bleak lands of northern Britain. The frontier was not a place of spectacle. It was mud, drizzle, and waiting. A soldier woke early to the sound of the tuba, the trumpet call that signaled the beginning of another day. His bed had been nothing more than a straw mattress inside a wooden barrack, warmed slightly if he was. Lucky enough to be close to the hearth, cold and damp if he was not. Blankets were coarse, woolen and itchy. Boots, the famous Calagay, might still be wet from yesterday's march. Before food, before drill, he had to make himself presentable, polishing his armor if he was on duty, oiling his sword to keep the damp from rusting the blade, checking his kit. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Coarse bread, a bowl of porridge maybe, a handful of dried fruit if supplies had come through recently. Wine was watered down. Beer, a local drink, was sometimes substituted, but many Romans considered it fit only for barbarians. After eating, duty began. Most soldiers did not spend their days fighting. Instead, they built. On the frontier, this meant endless construction. Projects, forts, watchtowers, causeways across marshy land, and defensive ditches. The Roman army functioned as much like a massive labor corps as it did a fighting force. Pickaxes rang against stony ground, shovels moved earth, and carts hauled timber cut from the surrounding forests. The soundscape of the frontier was not clashing swords, but the grind of work. For the officers, this was essential. An occupied soldier was a disciplined soldier. Idleness bred discontent, and discontent could spread quickly in a far-flung garrison. Patrolling the countryside was another daily task. Small groups would set out to walk the perimeter of Roman control, following tracks that wound through hills and bogs. They would see smoke rising from distant villages, hear the barking of dogs carried on the wind, and sometimes catch sight of local tribespeople watching from the tree line. The encounters were rarely battles. More often, they were tense standoffs. A Roman patrol glaring at a small group of locals across a stream, each side unwilling to make the first move. The tribes knew the land intimately. They knew where the ground turned treacherous, where bogs could swallow a careless soldier, where narrow passes allowed for ambush. For the Romans, each patrol carried the unease of not knowing what might wait just ahead. Inside the forts, life was governed by routine. Soldiers drilled in formation, practicing the same maneuvers over and over until they could perform them without thought. They cleaned their equipment, prepared rations, and stood guard at the gates. Guard duty was dull but vital. Standing at a wooden palisade in the rain, staring out into the mist, a soldier might feel the vast emptiness of the land around him. Fires from the civilian settlement outside the fort, the vicus, flickered in the distance. Traders, craftsmen, and families lived there, relying on the legion for protection. Their presence reminded the soldiers that they were not only guardians of Rome's empire, but also the anchor of a small and fragile community. The vicus brought some relief to the monotony. Off-duty, soldiers might wander to a tavern, drink stronger wine smuggled in by merchants, or by food spiced in ways that reminded them of home. Some formed relationships with local women, unofficial but tolerated. Children were born around forts, half Roman and half native, part of the quiet weaving together of cultures at the edge of empire. To the men of the ninth, these families offered a taste of stability in a life otherwise marked by impermanence. But there was also constant tension. Supplies came slowly. A delayed shipment of grain could mean days of half rations. Armor rusted quickly in the damp climate. Horses struggled in the boggy terrain. Roads, though well engineered, required constant maintenance. Each obstacle was small in itself, but together they created the grinding wear of frontier life. The Ninth's soldiers would have written letters home when they could. Wooden tablets have been found near Hadrian's Wall with inked messages that speak of ordinary concerns, requests for warmer clothing, mentions of birthdays missed, pleas for more food. These voices, faint across 2,000 years, remind us that the lost legion was not an abstraction, but thousands of individual men, each with his own desires and worries. When you imagine the disappearance of the Ninth, you should imagine not only soldiers in armor, but men with families waiting for them. Men whose absence meant unanswered letters and endless wandering. The frontier was not static. Rumors drifted in, tribes uniting, raids increasing, settlements refusing to pay tribute. Officers in the Ninth would have read reports, weighed options, and made decisions that affected the lives of thousands. Should they march north to show strength? Should they fortify the forts they already held? Should they try diplomacy or trust only in steel? These decisions were rarely glorious. They were slow, cautious, and filled with uncertainty. By the time the Ninth vanished from the record, the soldiers had likely been worn down by years of this life. Fatigue, cold, and unease were their constant companions, and so the disappearance becomes all the more haunting. It was not only the vanishing of a legion, but the sudden silencing of thousands of voices that had once filled the damp air of Britain's frontier. The question remains, what could have happened in this bleak, mud-soaked land that led not just to defeat, but to erasure? Was it the slow gnawing away of their strength until nothing remained? Or was there one sudden, devastating blow that the record keepers chose not to name? The land that swallowed legions for Rome, Britain, was always an uneasy province. When you think of the empire at its height, you might imagine the sun-drenched marble of the Mediterranean world. But Britain was different. To the Romans who served, there it felt remote, damp, and endlessly hostile. It was not just the people who resisted them, but the land itself. The disappearance of the Ninth Hispana cannot be separated from this environment, because the very ground of northern Britain conspired against Roman order. The Roman legions were used to marching on hard, dry soil, across landscapes where roads stayed firm underfoot and rivers could be bridged with engineering precision. But in the north, soldiers trudged through marshland that swallowed boots and wagons. Fog rolled in suddenly, obscuring vision. The forests were thick, ancient, untangled, filled with the creak of trees and the calls of unseen birds. To men, raised in the open plains of Italy or the structured cities of Gaul, this wilderness was unsettling. It had no order. The straight lines of Roman roads seemed fragile against it, thin scratches carved into a land that did not wish to be tamed. Climate added to the difficulty. Rain was frequent, soaking tents and supplies. Armor grew heavy with water and wooden. Palisades rotted faster than they could be repaired. Fires smoked instead of burned. Food spoiled. Even the iron of weapons corroded in the damp. To be a soldier here was to fight a battle not only against an enemy, but against the very weather that clung to your skin and seeped into your bones. Then there were the hills. Britain's northern terrain offered countless places for ambush. Valleys narrowed to choke points where a marching column could be trapped. Streams cut deep trenches in the land. Rocks and bracken provided natural cover. A Roman legion was a machine designed for open battlefields, where lines of soldiers could advance in order and shields could lock together in formation. In these hills, that formation broke apart. A march through the narrow passes meant that a legion could become a long, straggling column, vulnerable to sudden attack. And if local tribes struck from the slopes, the legion's discipline counted for little. The people who lived in these lands, the Brigantes in the north of England, the Caledonians further north in what is now Scotland, knew the terrain intimately. They did not fight like the Romans, and they did not need to. They could vanish into the trees after striking, leaving behind nothing but fear. To the Romans, this kind of warfare felt slippery, dishonorable, impossible to pin down. To the tribes, it was simply survival. They did not need to defeat Rome in pitched battle. They only needed to bleed it slowly, to make the empire feel that this land cost too much to hold. Imagine a Roman column of the 9th Hismana marching northward on a grey morning, standards carried ahead, the eagle of the legion glinting faintly. In the mist, behind it stretched a line of men 5,000 strong, their footsteps thudding against the sodden earth. Wagons creaked, horses snorted, officers barked commands. The road ahead narrowed into a valley, flanked by low hills. To a Roman officer, this was just another day's march. To the tribes watching from the ridges above, it was an opportunity. They knew where the path twisted, where escape would be difficult, where the ground grew bogggy. Did the 9th meet its fate in such a valley? Some scholars think so. There are whispers in the archaeological record of forts abandoned suddenly, of settlements destroyed, of a withdrawal that hints at catastrophe. If the 9th was marching to reassert control over rebellious tribes, they may have walked into a trap from which they never returned. But the silence in the Roman records suggests another possibility, that what happened was not a single dramatic ambush, but a long erosion, small raids, constant attrition, soldiers lost one by one until the legion could no longer function. In such a scenario, the 9th would not have been annihilated in one moment, but slowly dissolved into the wilderness, its survivors scattered, its standard perhaps taken, its memory quietly allowed to fade. To the bureaucrats in Rome, the difference hardly mattered. What mattered was that the 9th could no longer be counted, no longer be paid, no longer be entered on the rolls. The land had swallowed them, just as it had swallowed roads, forts, and attempts at control before this. Is the boring part of history that still leaves a haunting impression. Not the clash of armies, but the slow triumph of mud, rain, and forest over stone and steel. The empire prided itself on imposing order, but on this frontier, order was always fragile. A wall would later be built, stretching across the island to mark the edge of Roman control. And behind that wall lay the memory of the 9th, gone into the mist. So the question lingers, was it truly the tribes who destroyed the legion, or was it the land itself that proved unconquerable, quietly erasing 5,000 men from history? The weight of supply, the burden of empire, the Roman Empire stretched across 3 continents, and for much of its existence it prided itself on its ability to move armies, feed them, and house them with precision that impressed even its enemies. But every legion, no matter how disciplined or experienced, was only as strong as the supplies that kept it functioning. The 9th Hispana, stationed at the edge of the world in Britain, lived under the constant strain of that fragile system. To understand their disappearance, You must imagine the web of carts, ships, animals, scribes, and merchants upon which the soldiers' very survival depended. A Roman soldier marched with equipment that weighed close to 40 kilograms: armor, shield, sword, javelins, rations, and tools. He could not carry enough food for more than a few days. For long campaigns or permanent garrisons, supply had to come from elsewhere. Grain from farms in the south of Britain, salt shipped across from Gaul, wine brought in barrels from Spain or Italy. All of this had to be delivered across rough terrain to forts in the north. Roads, of course, were Rome's great invention. Straight lines of stone cut through the countryside, linking forts and towns. But building them was one thing. Maintaining them in the face of rain, frost, and constant use was another. Carts broke down, bridges collapsed, and mud turned even paved surfaces into treacherous paths. The ninth relied heavily on pack animals. Oxen hauled heavy carts laden with grain. Mules carried smaller loads of salt, oil, or preserved meat. Horses were reserved for cavalry and for couriers. Each animal needed fodder, and the farther north the legion went, the more difficult it became to secure. A long column of supply animals consumed its own cargo just by moving. The logistics of feeding an army in Britain were a constant balancing act, with calculations that could easily tip toward disaster if one link in the chain failed. Behind the soldiers marched a host of non-combatants: slaves, servants, cooks, and laborers. They were rarely mentioned in the official rolls, but they were essential. They baked bread in portable ovens, repaired harnesses, fetched water, and tended to animals. Their presence swelled the size of any marching column. A legion of 5,000 might move with an additional 1,000 or more dependents. This meant more mouths to feed, more fires to light, more exposure to danger. An ambush did not just threaten the soldiers, but the entire retinue of civilians and animals that trailed behind them. The administrative side of supply was just as complex. At headquarters, officers kept records of every grain sack delivered, every shipment of oil consumed, every cloak issued. Pay for soldiers was deducted for rations, meaning that even in distant Britain, a man's diet was tied to the empire's bureaucracy. A delay in pay or a shortfall in supply could sour morale quickly. Men might grumble about being cheated, about officers skimming from the top, about corrupt merchants watering down wine or delivering spoiled meat. Discipline was harsh for mutiny, but dissatisfaction spread quietly in conversations during long, wet nights in the barracks. In Britain, supply was not merely about logistics, but also about politics. The Romans depended on local elites to cooperate, to provide grain and resources, or at least not to obstruct the system. When relations with local tribes soured, the supply lines grew fragile. A single burned granary or a raided convoy could set off shortages that rippled across the frontier. It is not hard to imagine the Ninth Hispana feeling the pinch of such disruptions. Bread portions cut in half, rations of wine reduced, letters sent back to officers in Londinium pleading for more shipments. Winter made everything worse. Roads became impassable. Rivers swelled and bridges collapsed. Snow cut off passes. Soldiers huddled in forts, their breath misting in the cold air, eating whatever they could scavenge or stretch from the dwindling stores. Some forts show archaeological evidence of desperate winters. Bones of dogs gnawed for food, pits filled with animal remains hastily butchered, traces of sudden abandonment. If the ninth experienced one such winter, weakened and undersupplied, then by the time spring came, they may already have been too fragile to withstand a major tribal uprising. Think of the physical labor involved. Grain arrived in sacks weighing about 30 kilograms each. These had to be unloaded from ships at ports like York or along rivers, hauled onto carts, and dragged northward mile after mile. At each fort, they were stacked in storehouses with raised floors to keep out damp. Soldiers on fatigue duty lifted, carried, and counted each one. The daily grind of feeding 5,000 men meant endless repetition. Unload, carry, stack, count. If even one convoy failed to arrive, panic set in. A hungry soldier is less alert, less disciplined, more prone to illness. Multiply that by thousands, and you begin to see how quickly a legion could falter. Water was another concern. Forts were built near rivers or wells, but these sources could be fouled by enemies or strained by overuse. Soldiers dug ditches too, collect rainwater, or hauled it in buckets. In hostile territory, the act of fetching water became dangerous. Ambushes often took place at streams, where soldiers had laid aside shields and weapons to fill skins or jars. A single lost patrol meant fewer men returning to camp, fewer names on the next roll call. And then there was clothing. The damp climate rotted boots and cloaks. Soldiers were issued heavy woolen cloaks, but they were not waterproof. Cold seeped in, and frostbite was not unknown. Letters from Vindolanda, a fort near Hadrian's Wall, contain requests for more. Socks, more sandals, more cloaks. The soldiers of the ninth likely wrote similar pleas, their feet raw from long marches, their hands numb on the hilts of swords. All of this, the food, the clothing, the water, the animals, depended on scribes and clerks. These men, often overlooked, were the ones who entered numbers into wax tablets, who sealed orders with the mark of the legion, who sent dispatches south requesting more supplies. Imagine the scene: a clerk sitting in a drafty headquarters building, hunched over his desk, writing by lamplight, the smell of damp wool and smoke in the air. He lists the shortfall of grain, calculates how long the current stores will last, and adds a cautious note to the commander: without immediate resupply, the men will be forced to forage. Foraging meant trouble. It meant sending soldiers out into hostile countryside, seizing food from villages, cutting down grain before it could be harvested. This created resentment, and resentment meant resistance. A cycle began, shortages leading to harsher foraging leading to more rebellion leading to greater danger on the supply lines. In this way, the ninth may have been trapped in a spiral that tightened with each passing year. When we consider the disappearance of the ninth, it is easy to think in terms of sudden catastrophe, a lost battle, a bloody ambush, a dramatic last stand. But perhaps the true cause lay in these slow, grinding failures of supply. A legion without food, without warm clothing, without secure lines of communication, becomes vulnerable. Hunger saps discipline, cold saps strength, and endless shortages sap morale. A legion reduced to weakness could vanish not with a roar, but with a whimper, dissolving into the fog of Britain, scattered by smaller forces that under other circumstances they could have easily defeated. Think also of how this would have Looked on the paperwork back in Rome, reports delayed, numbers not matching, requests unanswered, clerks waiting for updates that never came. Somewhere in an office in the capital, a man in a toga adjusted his wax tablet, checked the legion lists, and frowned. The 9th Hispana's numbers were not there. Another month passed, still no news. And slowly, without ceremony, the legion was erased from the rolls. Its name no longer entered, its soldiers no longer paid. The empire moved on. It is tempting to imagine that the fate of armies is decided on the battlefield, but more often it is decided in the slow, dull processes of supply. A grain convoy delayed, a road washed out, a storehouse burned. These were the events that shaped the destiny of the 9th. And so, when you picture their disappearance, do not think first of swords and shields. Think of empty granaries, of DAMP cloaks, of cold fires. Think of the endless lists written by tired clerks, the sacks of grain that never arrived, the boots worn through to bare skin. These were the small, boring details that may have ended an entire legion. So the question remains, whispered across centuries, was the 9th destroyed by the sword of an enemy, or by the slow erosion of hunger, cold, and mismanagement? Stones, silence, and the archaeologist's puzzle when whole armies vanish from history. You might expect there to be ruins that scream of their fate, scorched forts, broken weapons, mass graves. But for the 9th Hispana, the archaeological record is quiet. What survives are faint scratches on stone, incomplete inscriptions, and the faint shadows of buildings in the soil. It is through these tiny remnants, boring to some, that scholars have tried to piece together the story of the legion's end. The last solid piece of evidence for the 9th comes from York, or Eboracum, as the Romans knew it. Inscriptions found there mention the legion around the year 108 CE, carved into stone. They celebrated building projects and repairs, everyday acts of military life recorded for posterity. Soldiers of the 9th, or their officers, paid for dedications to the gods. These inscriptions are not dramatic. They read like administrative notices, confirming that at this point, the legion was still very much alive, still drilling, still working. The names of centurions appear, along with formulas praising the emperor. Then, suddenly, the trail stops. No later inscriptions bear the name of the 9th in Britain. For a Roman legion, which usually left behind a steady stream of tombstones and monuments, this silence is startling. A few decades later, other legions are well documented in Britain, particularly the 6th Victrix, which seems to have replaced the 9th at York. The simplest explanation is that the 9th was destroyed or withdrawn, but archaeology rarely offers simple answers. When archaeologists excavate Roman forts in the north of England, they often find layers of abandonment, buildings suddenly left unused, timber posts collapsed, floors covered in silt. Some sites show signs of violent destruction, burned layers, scattered objects, hurried burials. Others show quieter endings, where occupation simply dwindled and stopped. Did the 9th fall victim to a catastrophic attack that left one of these scarred layers? Or did they suffer a slow attrition, their forts abandoned, not in fire, but in silence? At Vindolanda, a fort south of Hadrian's Wall, archaeologists discovered a remarkable cache of wooden writing tablets. These documents, written in ink on thin sheets of wood, record the daily lives of soldiers, duty rosters, supply lists, personal letters. They include requests for warmer clothing, notes about missing equipment, and invitations to birthday parties. Though the ninth is not explicitly mentioned in these tablets, they belong to the same era and the same frontier. They remind us that, if the ninth left traces, they may have been on perishable materials like these, letters and lists that rotted away in the damp soil, leaving only questions behind. Elsewhere, tombstones whisper clues. Roman soldiers were often buried near their forts, and their tombstones carried details of their service. If you walk through museums in Britain today, you can see the carved names of soldiers who served in legions across the empire. But curiously, after the early 2nd century, tombstones of the 9th soldiers are absent. Did this mean there were no survivors to carve stones for? Or were they removed, perhaps transferred to another frontier, leaving no local memory? One small inscription from Nijmegen in the Netherlands adds a layer of complication. It seems to refer to the 9th, after the supposed date of its disappearance. Was part of the legion transferred there? Or was this a remnant detachment, a small group of survivors reassigned after disaster? Archaeology often produces such fragments that raise more questions than they answer. A single stone, out of context, becomes a riddle. Was it proof of survival? Or a ghostly echo, a name reused by mistake? Even the forts themselves tell a story, though in the quietest of ways. At York, the legionary fortress shows signs of repair and continued use, but not by the 9th. Instead, the 6th Victrix took over, and its name appears in later inscriptions. Was the 9th replaced because it had been wiped out in Britain, or because it had been sent away and suffered its fate elsewhere? The stones are silent, but the change of names is as telling as any written chronicle. Archaeologists sometimes walk the landscape in search of negative evidence, the absence of things that should be there. In the north, if the 9th had continued to thrive, there should be tombstones, inscriptions, dedications, and casual graffiti bearing their mark. But the silence is overwhelming. To study this silence is to study a kind of absence that becomes its own form of evidence. It suggests that something happened so complete that the legion's memory was effectively erased from the land it once garrisoned. For historians, this is both frustrating and fascinating. Every stone with a missing name becomes a potential clue. Every abandoned fort is examined for layers of ash or destruction. Every stray inscription from elsewhere in the empire is scrutinized for the faint letters Legix Hisp. The work is painstaking, slow, and filled with uncertainty. It is not the kind of history that makes for easy answers, but it is the kind of history that reveals how fragile memory can be, and how easily entire communities can vanish. Into the soil, you can picture the archaeologist kneeling in the drizzle of northern England, brushing away dirt from a stone inscription. The letters are faint but legible. The name of an officer, a dedication to a god, a mention of repairs to a wall. Perhaps it dates to the time of the 9th, perhaps just after. The archaeologist debates, is this proof of survival or evidence of absence? They write notes, take photographs, pack the fragment carefully. In the lab later, under lamplight, they trace the letters again, comparing them to catalogues. The process is slow, repetitive, cautious, and always inconclusive. And so, The archaeology of the ninth is a collection of fragments, absences, and questions. There are no mass graves, no battlefields littered with armor, no definitive ruins of a last stand. There are only silences in the record, layers of abandonment in forts, stray inscriptions that may or may not belong. This is boring history in the truest sense, patient study of half-legible stones, cataloguing of broken tiles, endless debates over dates and contexts. Yet within that boredom lies the haunting mystery of a legion erased. So when you think of the ninth Hispaniola, remember not only the marching soldiers or the imagined battles, remember also the archaeologists with brushes in hand, the curators, labeling fragments, the scholars piecing together puzzles from silences. For it is in those tiny traces, or the lack of them, that the faint outline of the legion's disappearance still lingers. And the question remains, if the stones could speak more clearly, would they tell us of one sudden night of fire and slaughter, or of years of slow decline and quiet abandonment? Emperors, politics, and the paperwork of disappearance. When we search for the ninth Hispana, we are drawn naturally to wind-swept frontiers, where legionaries faced hostile tribes and uncertain weather. Yet the truth may lie elsewhere, not in the silence of the north, but in the bustle of Rome itself, in the smooth efficiency of the imperial bureaucracy. A legion could vanish in battle, yes, but it could also vanish in paperwork. To understand this, we must turn to the reign of Hadrian, and to the intricate dance of politics, empire, and military reform. The early 2nd century was a moment of transition for Rome. Emperor Trajan had just completed a reign of almost uninterrupted expansion. Under him, the empire had stretched to its furthest borders. Dacia conquered Arabia, added Armenia and Mesopotamia briefly under Roman sway. To sustain this, legions marched further than ever before, planting eagle standards in lands their ancestors had never seen. But the cost was immense. Men were scattered across distant provinces, and supply lines strained under the pressure. When Hadrian inherited the throne in 117 CE, he faced a different task. His role was not to expand, but to consolidate. He reversed many of Trajan's conquests and refocused the empire inward, strengthening borders rather than seeking glory abroad. This change of course had immediate consequences for the legions. Trajan had loved them, had spent time with them in the field, had valued expansion. Hadrian, by contrast, was a man of administration. He was a soldier, yes, and had served on campaigns, but his genius lay in reorganization and defense. He wanted fewer risky expeditions and more secure frontiers. This shift meant that some legions suddenly found themselves in redundant positions. A garrison once useful to Trajan's expansion might be unnecessary under Hadrian's retreat. And legions, though powerful, were also bureaucratic entities. They had to be fed, paid, and justified on a ledger. A legion without a clear role could simply be disbanded, merged, or quietly erased. The ninth Hispana, by all accounts, was not a legion of glory at this point in history. Its past contained both victories and humiliations. It had been battered. In Britain during the Boudiccan revolt in 60 CE, where it suffered severe losses, though rebuilt, its reputation may never have fully recovered. Later, while other legions fought dazzling campaigns under Trajan in Dacia and the East, the ninth remained in Britain, a difficult posting where victories were few and morale often strained. To some in Rome, it may have seemed like an unlucky legion stationed at the edge of the world, far from the center of imperial power. Hadrian visited Britain in the 120s CE, a journey that left behind one of the most famous monuments of Roman defensive strategy, Hadrian's Wall. But before that war was begun, Britain was restless. Revolts had broken out, forts were attacked, and the army there faced challenges both from local tribes and from the harsh landscape. If the Ninth was still stationed at York at this time, they may have been deeply involved in these struggles. Perhaps they suffered a disaster, a crushing defeat that Rome preferred not to record. Yet perhaps their disappearance was quieter, a matter of imperial strategy rather than battlefield tragedy. One theory suggests that Hadrian deliberately removed the Ninth from Britain, either because they had failed him or simply because he wanted to reorganize his forces. He then replaced them with the Sixth Victrix, transferred from the continent. This would explain why the Ninth vanishes from Britain's record, while York continues to thrive as a legionary base. The replacement looks, in political terms, like a reshuffling of the board. One legion disappears, another takes its place, and imperial strategy carries on smoothly. To the emperor, it may have seemed like a tidy administrative adjustment. To us, to millennia later, it looks like a mystery. Imperial politics in Rome also shaped how such disappearances were remembered. Emperors preferred to celebrate victories and hide defeats. Roman history was often written with propaganda in mind. A legion destroyed by barbarians was an embarrassment to the emperor's prestige. Better to let it fade from records quietly. Replaced by another, the paperwork filed neatly in the archives. Scholars point to other cases where legions simply vanish from inscriptions. Their names retired, their standards perhaps merged into other units. Sometimes this was the result of disaster, other times the result of deliberate policy. The silence may be less a reflection of sudden annihilation and more a reflection of imperial censorship. Hadrian's priorities were clear. He wanted to fortify borders, Hadrian's Wall in Britain, the limes in Germany, and strong defensive systems elsewhere. To staff these fortifications, he needed legions he trusted. Perhaps the Ninth, with its checkered past and questionable morale, did not fit his vision. By replacing them with the Sixth Victrix, he ensured that Britain was guarded by fresh troops whose loyalty and discipline he trusted. The Ninth may have been reassigned elsewhere, perhaps to the Rhine or the East, where their fate was sealed in obscurity. If they were broken up or merged with another legion, their name would have simply disappeared, erased by imperial decision rather than tribal swords. Politics also shaped how governors handled local disasters. If the Ninth was destroyed in Britain, the governor would have been under immense pressure to report it carefully. He might downplay the defeat, emphasizing reinforcements and rebuilding rather than the scale of loss. Reports to Rome might have been crafted to protect careers, shifting blame or simply omitting details. By the time news reached the emperor, it might have been reframed as a necessary reorganization rather than a humiliating disaster. And in the carefully curated histories written later, the emperor's dignity was always preserved. We also must consider the Roman practice of damnatio memoria, the deliberate erasure of memory. Though this usually applied to individuals, not legions, the principle was similar. To erase a failure, Rome sometimes erased the name itself. If the ninth had disgraced itself by defeat, mutiny, or some other misfortune, removing its name from records would serve as a warning and a cover-up at the same time. A legion that no longer existed could not tarnish the empire's image, and yet this bureaucratic disappearance was not absolute. As we saw earlier, stray inscriptions hint at the ninth's survival elsewhere, perhaps in the Netherlands or along the Danube. These could represent fragments of the legion reassigned after Hadrian's reorganization. They suggest that politics, not slaughter, may explain the silence in Britain. The ninth may have dwindled not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of quiet decisions, a transfer here, a merger there, until finally the legion was gone. Its eagle standard retired, its name struck from the rolls. In this light, the ninth's fate may reflect something larger about Rome itself. Empires often prefer tidy stories, victories, monuments, eternal glory. But the reality of administration is messier. Soldiers are shuffled like numbers in a ledger. Units are erased with a stroke of the pen. An emperor's priorities shape the destinies of thousands of men, who may vanish from memory not because they died in battle, but because they no longer fit the needs of the state. The story of the ninth is as much about bureaucracy as it is about war. Imagine Hadrian, seated in Rome or Antioch, reviewing lists of legions. He weighs his priorities: secure Britain, but not at the cost of overstretching resources. Replace unreliable troops with those he trusts. Transfer units to the Rhine, where pressure from Germanic tribes mounts. Somewhere in those lists, the name Legio X Hispana is crossed out. Not in anger, not in ceremony, but as part of a broader plan. A simple administrative act, yet one that sealed the legion's place in history, or rather in mystery. This bureaucratic vanishing explains why archaeology struggles to find a dramatic trace. There was no last battlefield littered with broken swords, no great funeral mound of leaked maraes. Instead, there was a gradual administrative erasure hidden in the folds of imperial decision-making. To modernize, it feels unsatisfying. We long for drama, for a last stand, for a heroic defeat. But perhaps the truth is that the ninth's end was boring. Paperwork, transfers, and the quiet retirement of a name. Still, the politics of Hadrian's reign give us a frame. He was not careless, nor was he sentimental. He built walls, not epics. He secured frontiers, not legends. In such a world, the ninth Hispana was expendable, whether as casualties in Britain, as a shuffled unit abroad, or as a name erased for reasons of imperial pride. And so the legion's fate becomes a reflection of Hadrian's empire itself, organized, practical, quietly ruthless, and willing to bury inconvenient truths under marble inscriptions that celebrated stability over glory. And here, as the lamps dim and the silence of the record closes in again, we return to the puzzle. Did the ninth vanish in the bogs and forests of Britain, torn apart by rebellion? Or did they vanish in the files of imperial administrators, reorganized out of existence? Both possibilities are shaped by politics, by the needs of emperors, by the delicate balance of prestige and power. In either case, the ninth Hispana slipped from history not with the clash of swords alone, but with the quiet efficiency of Rome's political machinery. From legion to legend, the ninth in story and imagination. When the last traces of the ninth legion fade from the official record, What comes after is not silence, but something even more enduring. Stories. Human beings are rarely content to leave a mystery untended. Where the written evidence ends, the imagination begins to stir, and in the centuries after the ninth's disappearance, their fate became a canvas on which storytellers, historians, and eventually novelists and filmmakers painted their own versions of the truth. The seeds of these myths began with the gaps in the Roman record itself. The administrative silence around the ninth's fate created fertile ground for speculation. Later, historians, poring over incomplete lists of legions, tried to explain where the missing unit had gone. Some assumed it had perished in the damp hills of northern Britain, cut down by Caledonian warriors who vanished into the mist as quickly as they struck. Others speculated that the legion had not died, but been redeployed quietly elsewhere, two regions where records were thin and monuments scarcer. This ambiguity made the ninth unique. It was neither fully present in the Empire's closing chapters, nor entirely gone, but hovering somewhere in between. That hovering uncertainty was what allowed myth to blossom. During the Middle Ages, echoes of Rome remained in Britain's landscape. Ruined walls, broken stones, and weathered inscriptions whispered of legions long gone, and local legends sometimes clung to these remnants. While we cannot say for certain that the ninth was remembered specifically in these tales, it is likely that the memory of Roman soldiers lost in hostile country was absorbed into the fabric of folklore, for peoples living among the ruined remnants of Roman forts. The idea of an army swallowed by the wilderness felt both plausible and haunting. The story of the ninth rose to prominence again much later. In the 18th and 19th centuries, when antiquarians and early historians began to dig more systematically into Rome's past, they noticed the legion's disappearance and were intrigued by its implications. At this time, Europe was fascinated by the idea of lost armies and vanished civilizations. The Romantics in particular loved the thought of brave men meeting tragic ends far from home, of silence and ruins covering the noise of forgotten battles. The ninth fit perfectly into this sensibility. To them, the legion became a symbol of hubris checked by nature, of empire undone not by politics but by the wild, unmapped edge of the world. It was in the 20th century, however, that the ninth truly became a legend in popular imagination. The most famous retelling came in 1954, when Scottish author Rosemary Sutcliffe published her novel The Eagle of the Ninth. In it, she imagined a young Roman officer traveling into the north to uncover what had become of the legion and to recover its lost eagle standard. Sutcliffe's story combined historical detail with adventure and melancholy, weaving together the bones of Roman Britain with the timeless pull of a quest. The book became a beloved classic, especially for young readers, and shaped how generations would think about the ninth. The legion's fate, in Sutcliffe's hands, was not just about soldiers dying, but about memory, honor, and identity. Her vision was powerful because it filled the silence with meaning. Instead of faceless men lost in battle, she gave us characters who lived, loved, and longed for home. The lost eagle's standard, which in Roman culture symbolized the very soul of a legion, became the perfect metaphor for the missing ninth. To lose it was to lose not only soldiers, but the very essence of who they were. Filmmakers followed. In 2011, a Hollywood adaptation simply titled The Eagle Brought Sutcliffe's Tale to the Screen. Around the same time, another film, The Centurion 2010, imagined a grim and violent tale of Roman survivors fleeing northward into hostile lands. These films dramatize the disappearance as a cinematic epic, long marches, desperate battles, and rugged landscapes drenched in fog and blood. The Ninth, by then, had transcended history. They had become an archetype, the embodiment of the doomed army that vanishes into the wilderness. Why does this story resonate so deeply? Part of the answer lies in how it allows each age to project its own concerns onto the Ninth. For the Victorians, it was a cautionary tale of imperial limits. Even mighty Rome could falter when faced with the stubborn defiance of tribal peoples. For the mid-20th century, amid the ruins of 2 world wars, the story spoke of loss, memory, and the futility of conquest. For modern audiences, with their taste for gritty realism and survival stories, the Ninth became a symbol of endurance against impossible odds. Yet beneath these shifting retellings, the myth of the Ninth retains a quiet, persistent core. The mystery itself. Human beings are drawn to what cannot be fully explained. An unanswered question has a stronger hold on the imagination than one that has been neatly tied up. The disappearance of the Ninth offers that irresistible gap, a place where certainty fails and only wonder remains. One can imagine that in the misty glens of Scotland, where ruins of Roman forts still lie buried under grass, the story of the Ninth lingers like a half-heard echo. Hikers and historians pause at the remnants of walls and roads and wonder if those stones once bore witness to the legion's march. Children reading Sutcliffe or watching films grow up with the image of Roman soldiers trudging northward, banners drooping in the damp air, never to return. Whether the legion truly perished in one sudden blow, or quietly faded into obscurity elsewhere, the legend is the same. A Roman force lost to time, a question that history never answered in the end. The Ninth lives not in stone inscriptions or military lists, but in the imaginations of those who ponder them. Their fate has become a mirror for each generation to hold up to its own fears and fascinations. Were they defeated by savage tribes? Were they victims of political expediency, shuffled away and erased? Or did they dissolve quietly, their memory only preserved because of the curiosity that followed? Each version is less about the legion itself and more about the people telling the story. As you think of the Ninth, not just as soldiers, but as characters woven into legend, you might ask yourself, is the myth of their loss more powerful than any historical truth we could ever uncover? Empires mirror the Ninth and the British imagination, the fate of the Ninth Legion, wrapped as it is in silence and uncertainty, did not only fascinate historians and novelists. Over time, it came to serve as a kind of mirror in which Britain itself, centuries after the Romans had gone, saw something of its own imperial story reflected. In the hazy outlines of the Lost Legion, many found lessons about power, fragility, and the strange ways in which empires both endure and vanish. When Britain itself began to build an empire in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Romans were often held up as the most immediate model. Schoolboys translated Caesar's commentaries in the classroom. Victorian statesmen compared their conquests in India, Africa, and the Pacific to Rome's advance into Gaul and Britain. The stones of Hadrian's Wall, still stretching across Northern England offered a visible reminder that another great empire had once ruled here, had once marked its boundary between order and wilderness. The story of the ninth fitted neatly into this comparison. If the Roman Empire represented the first great attempt to project order across Britain, the story of its missing legion carried a warning that even the mightiest powers could stumble. For Victorians, who loved both to celebrate imperial triumph and to brood upon its possible dangers, the ninth became a cautionary tale. They imagined disciplined Roman soldiers marching into the unknown north, never to return, as if swallowed up by the wilderness. It seemed to prove the empire had limits that, the farther one pushed against alien landscapes and peoples, the more fragile the project became. This theme resonated particularly as Britain's own empire reached its zenith in the late 19th century. The newspapers brimmed with tales of distant campaigns, of small regiments of red-coated soldiers holding out in remote forts, of massacres and sudden defeats in faraway places. The disaster at Isandlwana in 1879, when a Zulu army overwhelmed a British column in South Africa, was often compared to Rome's disasters. Likewise, the lost columns in Afghanistan or the tragedies of imperial retreat in the Sudan carried echoes of the ninth. Just as the Romans had met a mysterious end in Britain's north, so too might the British find themselves overwhelmed in lands they sought to master. Writers and artists drew on this parallel. To imagine the end of the ninth was to imagine a scene of imperial fragility. Banners trampled in the mud, watchfires left cold, a silence settling over forts that once rang with military order. In those images lay an unspoken question: could Britain too one day meet a similar silence? The story became a meditation on impermanence. Empires rose and fell, and even when their stones remained, their armies and ambitions vanished into history. In the 20th century, as Britain's empire waned, the ninth took on fresh meaning. Rosemary Sutcliffe's The Eagle of the Ninth, published in 1954, appeared in a post-war Britain still reckoning with loss. The novel's themes: duty, memory, the recovery of lost honor, spoke not only to Roman history, but to a society that had just lived through the trauma of global conflict and was watching its colonies slip away. For many readers, the tale of a lost legion in a hostile land resonated with feelings of both nostalgia and melancholy. It was no longer just about Rome. It was about Britain itself, facing the fading of its own power. Even the image of Hadrian's Wall gained symbolic weight. In this period, no longer merely a ruin, it became a national monument, a place where people could reflect on boundaries, belonging, and the legacies of empire. Walking along its weathered stones, many visitors thought of the ninth and their supposed doom somewhere. Beyond the wall, the landscape became a stage on which Britain could remember both the grandeur and the fragility of imperial ambition. Modern scholarship has often tried to cut through the myth, to insist that the ninth's fate was less dramatic, perhaps an administrative reshuffling rather than a massacre. Yet, in the public imagination, the darker, more tragic version persists. This persistence tells us something important. It suggests that the story matters less as literal history than as a parable. The British imagination has long been haunted by the idea that empire carries the seeds of its own undoing, that the wilderness or the resistance of peoples at the edge will always have the power to swallow armies whole. In this way, the 9th continues to live on as part of Britain's national story. It is a Roman tale, but also a British one, retold and reshaped to express anxieties about conquest, decline, and memory. To speak of the Lost Legion is not only to look back at ancient history, but to reflect on Britain's own centuries of expansion and retreat. The legend of the 9th is less about what truly happened on some rainy battlefield in the 2nd century, and more about the long shadow of empire itself. And so the 9th endures, not only in stones, ruins, and inscriptions, but in the cultural memory of a people who saw their own story mirrored in the Romans. The legion's absent sight's disappearance from the page of history became a presence in the imagination, an echo reminding later generations that no empire, however strong, can march endlessly forward without facing its own silence. Digging for shadows, science, and the search for the 9th, the silence of the 9th Legion has long tempted storytellers, but it has also drawn the patient gaze of archaeologists. If the written record trails off into uncertainty, perhaps the earth itself still holds a memory. For more than a century, spades, trowels, and in recent decades, more subtle instruments of science have been turned toward Britain's soil in hopes of catching a whisper of the vanished soldiers. Archaeology is, in its way, the slowest and quietest of conversations. A trench is cut into the earth, layers of soil peeled back like pages of a book, each stratum holding traces of past lives. In the case of the 9th, the search has often focused on northern Britain, the long marches of York to the Wall, and beyond into the rugged hills and boggy moors of Scotland. Here, forts once bristled with Roman stonework, ditches carved too, mark control, watchtowers set like beads along supply lines. Today many lie as grassy mounds or tumbled stones, yet archaeologists have returned to them time and again, hoping for a clue. One of the most evocative finds came not from the frontier, but from the fort of York, the Legion's last confirmed station. Inscriptions carved into stone dedications to gods. Records of building works show the 9th still active around the turn of the 2nd century, but the trail grows cold after that. The absence of later inscriptions, so clear for other units, feels almost like a silence carved in stone. Was the Legion transferred abroad, or did it vanish here? Archaeologists linger over each fragment of inscription, comparing letter shapes, styles of carving, seeking to pin down a date as precisely as possible. Modern methods add new layers of subtlety. Ground-penetrating radar allows archaeologists to scan beneath fields without lifting a spade, revealing faint outlines of buried walls and ditches. A scatter of anomalies beneath a farmer's pasture might hint at a forgotten marching camp, perhaps one that saw the 9th pass through. LiDAR light detection and ranging, fired from aircraft strips, away the vegetation in a digital model, laying bare the contours of ancient earthworks invisible to the naked eye. Ridges and embankments, smoothed by centuries of weather, emerge clearly on a computer screen, suggesting where soldiers once dug their defenses. Even bones may speak. Advances in DNA analysis have opened new questions about the Roman army's diversity and movement. The legions were not only composed of Italians, but of recruits from Spain, Gaul, the Balkans, and beyond. If skeletal remains are unearthed in frontier cemeteries, scientists can sometimes trace isotopes in their teeth, revealing where they grew up, what water they drank as children. In this way, individual soldiers take on a faint biography, whether they came from the Mediterranean sun or the damp Atlantic coast. If ever a mass grave were to be found, containing dozens of men of the right age and era, science could help test whether they bore the signature of legionaries. So far, no such grave has been uncovered that can be confidently tied to the 9th, yet the hope lingers that the soil may yet give up such a secret. Inscriptions remain another quiet line of inquiry. A single stone fragment, found in the Netherlands, was once thought to reference the 9th, suggesting the legion had been transferred out of Britain and stationed on the Rhine. Later readings cast doubt, yet the very possibility shows how scholars scrutinize every carved letter for the faintest hint. A dedication from a centurion here, a tombstone there each, might shift the narrative of where the 9th last stood. And then there is the wall itself, stretching across northern England. Its construction began during Hadrian's reign only. A few years after the 9th disappears from British inscriptions, some have speculated that the 9th's loss, whether by battle or dispersal, prompted the emperor to mark a fixed boundary, a visible decision that Britain's north was not to be conquered but contained. Archaeology along the wall has yielded endless finds, altars, armor fittings, tools of daily life, yet none can be securely tied to the 9th. Still, as visitors walk its length, they often imagine the missing legion, their boots pressing the same turf. The search is ongoing, never fully satisfied. Every new dig raises as many questions as it answers. Was the 9th broken and scattered in a northern campaign? Did it march away to fight in the east, its traces swallowed by shifting records? Or does its story lie still beneath the soil, in some yet unopened barrow or long-forgotten ditch? Archaeology offers patience, not closure. There is something fitting in that, for the 9th, defined as much by its absence as by its deeds, perhaps only a fragment here, a shadow there, will ever be found. The work of science becomes not only a quest for certainty, but an act of remembrance. Every time a radar sweep passes over a field, every time a trench is dug in a windswept fort, we are listening again for the silence of the missing legion, and so the story continues, half in the soil, half in the imagination. Modern science may yet uncover a grave, a cluster of inscriptions, or a lost camp that sharpens the outline of their fate. Until then, the 9th remains partly ours to dream about, a mystery half written in earth, half left untold. Other vanished hosts, the 9th among the lost armies of history. When we speak of the 9th Legion, it is often with a sense of hush, as if the soldiers have walked into fog and never returned. Yet in the long memory of history, they are not alone. Other armies, greater and lesser, have melted away, leaving behind little more than rumor and fragments. To reflect on these comparisons is to place the 9th within a wider human pattern of disappearance, of forgetting, and of the strange allure of the unknown. The first and most obvious parallel, for any student of Rome, is the disaster of the Teutoburg forest. In the year 09 CE, 3 legions, nearly 20,000 men were ambushed in the thick German woods by an alliance of tribes under the leadership of Arminius. Over 3 days of rain, confusion, and desperate fighting, the Roman forces were cut down to the last man. Unlike the 9th, we know much of their fate, for Roman writers recorded it with horror. Yet even here, the mists creep in. Archaeologists still debate the exact location of the battlefield. What remains is scattered across German soil, twisted. Weapons, human bones, gnawed by wolves, fragments of armor. For Rome, Teutoburg was a wound that never quite healed. A reminder that entire legions could vanish from the rolls in a single catastrophe. When scholars ponder the ninth, they cannot help but weigh it against this earlier calamity. Was Britain's north a second Teutoburg? Only one less well remembered. Further afield, the vanished host of Cambyses, king of Persia, enters the conversation. Around 524 BCE, Herodotus tells us, Cambyses sent an army of 50,000 men into the Egyptian desert to suppress a rebellious oracle at Siwa. The soldiers marched into the sands and never came out. A great storm of the desert is said to have buried them alive, their bones lost beneath shifting dunes. For centuries the story was dismissed as legend. Yet in recent times, archaeologists and explorers have claimed to find traces of arrowheads, fragments of textiles, human remains weathered by sand. Whether the army was swallowed whole or scattered piecemeal by the desert, the image of a vanished host echoes the same mystery that clings to the ninth. The strange silence where a marching column once was. Other echoes ring across history. In the 6th century, a Byzantine force sent into Arabia is said to have perished in a sudden sandstorm, leaving no survivors to tell their tale. In the 14th, a Mongol army advancing into Syria disappeared almost without trace, consumed not by storm or ambush, but by plague. In each case, the tale takes on the quality of myth. The soldiers who set out, the silence that follows, the uncertainty of their end. It is the uncertainty that gives these stories their power. An army destroyed in a set-piece battle leaves monuments, chronicles, and names to anchor it in memory. But an army that vanishes, whether in forest, desert, or northern moor, becomes a canvas for the imagination. The ninth belongs to that peculiar category. Not quite as well documented as Teutoburg, not quite as mythical as Cambyses' host. It rests in the middle ground, a gap in the record, large enough to tempt every generation to wonder. For Britain, this comparison lent a special weight. To see the ninth as a lost legion, swallowed by the highlands or moors, was to cast the northern tribes as the equal of Arminius, or even the desert storms that devoured Persia's men. To imagine the ninth marching into Scotland and never returning, is to place those misted hills among the world's great killing grounds. Whether or not the comparison is fair, it has shaped how the legion is remembered, not as one unit quietly reassigned, but as one that vanished into myth like others before and after. The parallels remind us that disappearance is a theme running through history's fabric. Men, armies, even whole peoples sometimes slip beyond the edge of the written page. The ninth is part of that pattern, its silence mirrored in Teutoburg's carnage, in the sands of Siwa, in the plagues and storms that have erased so many lives, and perhaps that is why we still linger on their story. For when we gather these tales together, candle in hand, it is not only the ninth we are speaking of, but of all who have walked into the mist and not returned. The ninth legion in classrooms, museums, and the popular imagination when children first open a history book on ancient Rome. They are often greeted with pictures of shining helmets, marching columns, and the straight roads that cut across Europe. Somewhere in the margins of that tale, The Ninth Legion often appears, not always as a certainty, but as a tantalizing question. Teachers, perhaps eager to spark curiosity, linger on the mystery. Here was a legion of Rome that disappeared, its fate unknown. In the hush of a classroom, it is easy to imagine a line of red shields marching north, only to melt into mist. For young minds, this is a story that lingers longer than dates and emperors. It is a riddle, an adventure that never quite resolves. Museums, too, have long leaned on the Ninth to invite visitors into the Roman past. A cracked inscription from York that names the legion, a scattering of stamped tiles, fragments of weaponry objects that in themselves are small and ordinary, yet they carry the heavy weight of absence. Curators arrange these items in glass cases and let the silence speak. Visitors peer at the carved letters Leg Ix, Hispana, and imagine the lives behind them. Soldiers eating bread in a fort, officers writing letters home, children running across a parade ground. That the trail goes cold after a certain date only sharpens the intrigue. It is not only what is displayed, but what is missing that draws people in. In Britain, especially, the Ninth has become a doorway into the Roman story. To walk Hadrian's Wall and read about the garrisons is one thing. To stand before a stone that bears the mark of the Ninth, and then to be told, "We do not know what became of them," is quite another. It invites the visitor to lean forward, to step imaginatively into history's shadows. School trips to Roman sites often end with that quiet moment of speculation. What would it have been like to be a soldier of the Ninth? Standing on the edge of the known world, not knowing whether Rome would remember you. Popular history has also found in the Ninth a ready companion. The story is brief enough to be told in an article, mysterious enough to draw readers, and flexible enough to be shaped in different ways. Some writers make of it a tale of tragedy, imagining the legion destroyed in a single violent uprising. Others prefer the quieter version, where the legion was simply reassigned, its later record lost. In either form, the Ninth serves as an introduction to the texture of Roman life. The way armies were moved like chess pieces, the way names and numbers could vanish into bureaucratic silence, and the way frontiers often devoured those who manned them. Children's history books in the 20th century sometimes gave the Ninth a special prominence. Maps of Britain shaded in the Roman roads often included a sidebar, the vanished legion, illustrated in muted watercolors. It offered a page of suspense amid the steady march of emperors and battles. For many, it was their first brush with the idea that history holds mysteries not yet solved. The Ninth became a symbol of the past's unfinished business. Museums have not been content only to display objects. Some have built reconstructions, a stretch of wall, a wooden gateway, a barrack room furnished with rough bunks and clay pots. Visitors walk through these spaces and imagine the soldiers who once lived there. A whispered audio track may speak of the Ninth, of its disappearance, of the thin thread of evidence left behind. In such places, the legion is not just a name, but an atmosphere, a quiet presence that makes the stones seem more alive. Even popular media television, documentaries, glossy magazine features, interactive websites return to the Ninth whenever. They seek to give the Roman past a hint of mystery. The formula is familiar. The narrator gestures to the cold, windswept hills of the north. The camera lingers on an inscription or a broken tile, and the question is posed: What really happened to the Ninth Legion? Viewers lean closer. A story of stone walls and old maps is suddenly transformed into a living mystery, still awaiting its answer. In this way, the Ninth has served education not only as an object of study, but as an invitation. It is a hook that draws the curious into the deeper waters of Roman life. Behind the vanished legion lie lessons about empire, about frontier life, about the fragility of human memory. To teach the Ninth is to teach not only about what Rome was, but about how history itself works, how it remembers, and how it forgets. And so, whether in classrooms or behind glass, in guidebooks or in documentaries, the Ninth continues its quiet service. It may never march again upon the moors of Britain, but it still leads processions of minds into the Roman world. Its silence, paradoxically, speaks more clearly than many recorded victories. The silence that remains history is often told as a chain of certainties. This emperor ruled here, this battle was fought there, this wall was built and still stands. Yet within that chain there are gaps, quiet places where the links are missing. The Ninth Legion lives in one of those spaces. We know that it existed. We can read its name carved into stone. We can follow its march along Roman roads as far as York. And then, as though a curtain falls, the record ends. No trumpet announces its disappearance. No writer sets down the tale. It simply fades. There is a kind of gentleness in that silence. Other legions were remembered because they were destroyed in fire and terror. Their deaths were written in letters and speeches carried as warnings to future generations. The Ninth, by contrast, left no such record of ruin. Whether it fell in battle or was slowly dissolved into the great churn of the empire, or merely transferred far from Britain's cold soil, its end was quiet. History does not always close its stories with a full stop. Sometimes it trails into a lingering ellipsis. For 2,000 years, that ellipsis has invited us to lean closer. Scholars pore over inscriptions, measuring each line of text to see if it conceals the legion's afterlife. Archaeologists kneel in muddy fields, brushing soil from fragments of pottery stamped with a familiar mark. Children on school trips press their noses against museum glass and wonder, where did they go? In each case, the silence does not repel curiosity, it draws it in. And perhaps that is the Legion's most enduring gift. In its absence, it has taught us to accept that history does not always give answers. The past is not a book we can read. From cover to cover, some pages are missing, some are smudged, and some have been torn away entirely. Yet even those missing pages have their value, for they remind us that memory itself is fragile, and that mystery has its place alongside knowledge. In Britain, the Ninth has become part of the landscape's own story. Walk the misty hills near Hadrian's Wall, and the silence seems to echo with unrecorded footsteps. Cross the cobbled roads in York, and you pass the same ground where the Legion once drilled. Their traces are faint, yet enough to tether imagination. They are not ghosts in the frightening sense, but presences in the gentler one. Shadows that make the present richer, because the past beneath it is not fully known. Storytellers have seized upon this absence and turned it into legend. In their novels and films, the Ninth may fight glorious last stands, or march into the wilderness never to return, or dissolve into the native peoples they once opposed. None of these tales is certain, yet each is a way of keeping the silence alive, giving shape to what history cannot say. In this way, the Legion still marches, not on roads of stone, but on the roads of memory and imagination. As we reflect, we might find comfort in that persistence. The ninth is not lost entirely. It lives wherever people whisper its name, wherever students are introduced to the puzzle of its end, wherever archaeologists hope for a new discovery. Like many things in life, it survives not as a fact, but as a question. And sometimes, a question is more enduring than an answer. So the Legion remains. Not in order of battle, not in shining armor, but in the quiet rhythm of speculation, in the soft voices of museum halls, in the slow steps of those who walk the ruined walls at dusk. Its silence is its story, and in that silence there is a strange peace. The Ninth Legion does not return to us, yet in the persistence of its mystery, we are reminded that history is not only about what we know, but also about what we are content to wonder, and perhaps that is enough. And so, the Ninth Legion slips once more into the hush of history, leaving only faint footprints in the earth and whispers in the mind. Perhaps they were lost, perhaps they marched elsewhere, perhaps they simply melted into time, but whatever, their fate, their silence, has become their legacy. As you drift toward rest, let the unanswered question of the ninth be like a lullaby, reminding you that not everything needs a clear ending, and that mystery itself can be gentle company in the night.